The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
For those of you joining, we are just going to wait a few more minutes to get people. Still see the attendee numbers rising up and haven't quite hit the RSVP. So I know it's 6 o'clock. We are going to get started here in just a couple of minutes. Hey, we're just we're rolling. Still seeing a bunch of people joining up, so we're gonna give it a few more minutes as some other people join on. But thank you so much for coming on. I know we're about 3 after 6, so we will get started in the very, very near future. For people who are interested in getting audio, the question just popped up. So number one, it looks like we know how to use the question box, so that'll be helpful. But if you can't get audio through your computer, there is an option to dial in. So you should be able to see that when you pop up. There's an option for phone audio, and it'll give you a dial-in number, a meeting code, and your own attendee code. All right, I think we'll get rolling. Ron, you want to take it away?
Happy to take it away, Ari. Thanks. So, on behalf of the New England Air Museum, I'd like to welcome everybody to our first Aerospace Industry Business After Hours webinar. Many of you know that we've had a number of on-site events similar to this, but in person. This is the first time we've attempted to use this format. I think we've got a great turnout for tonight, so it looks like we may be doing this more often. I'd like to start off by thanking the people who've really made this possible. First, IT Direct, and you'll hear from Ari Santiago in just a moment. We've never done this at the Air Museum, and without the technical support of Ari and IT Direct and their team, we would not have been able to put this together. So I really appreciate all of the work that they've put into making tonight possible. Also, fabulous sponsors that we have that make this possible: Key Bank, Robinson and Cole, Cohn Resnick, and Stangeron and Associates all have really stepped up and made this possible tonight with their financial support. So we thank them as well. Looking at my notes, we right now want to turn this over to Ari, who will tell you a little bit about the format for the evening, answer some important technical questions, and then we'll get on with the program.
Thanks so much, Ron. Really appreciate it. For those of you that don't know who I am, I'm Ari Santiago, the CEO and president of IT Direct. We're a technology success provider in Hartford and New Haven. We work with manufacturers all throughout Connecticut, helping them leverage information technology to reach their business goals and take their businesses to new levels. And I'm also the host of the Made in America podcast, which is a podcast that focuses on celebrating Connecticut manufacturing. We really have two goals with the podcast. One is to engage the overall community in Connecticut to help them see the value and the vibrancy of manufacturing in Connecticut. And second, to provide a platform of peer learning where we interview and share information from manufacturing leaders to other manufacturing leaders. Peer learning has been a very powerful tool in my life to help me reach the success that I've had, and I've seen it be so powerful for so many others. And so we provide a platform for everyone to share what they're doing and learn from each other. I've always believed that together we'll rise faster and more successfully. And of course, in this time, it's now more important than ever. So certainly appreciate that. And there's a handout in the webinar format you can download about the podcast. And so on that point, for those of you that have joined in, we've muted everybody, and we will keep that mute on for the duration of the program. However, you'll notice there's a question box. So if you haven't seen it, when you logged into the GoToWebinar, a box should have popped up with a number of options in it. And you'll see one of those options says questions. If you click the little arrow to the left, it'll open it up and you can type in a question. So please feel free, as Richard's going through his presentation, to jot down your questions, and we'll do a Q&A session at the end where Ron and I will go through those questions, pull them forward so Rich can answer it on this very, very important and urgent topic. The last thing I'll just say is if you're having any audio difficulties, certainly with everybody working from home and kids streaming Netflix and whatnot, we've certainly seen quite a strain on people's home internet. And so if you're using computer audio and it's choppy, best thing to do is switch over to phone audio. There's a phone number you can get and dial in. So if you have any problems with that, please feel free to put that into the question as well, and we'll get to you. So that's it. Enjoy the program. I think this is great. Ron, I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks, Ari. And now I'm going to turn the program over to Scott Ashton, who is the president of the board of directors of the New England Air Museum, and he has some remarks to make. Scott?
Thanks, Ron. And good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us at the New England Air Museum Aerospace Business After Hours event tonight with Richard Aboulafia. I'm board president Scott Ashton, and again, I want to recognize our sponsors for tonight's event. I want to thank Brad Hardy from Key Bank, Jeff White from Robinson & Cole, Bob Stangeron from Stangeron and Associates, Cone Resnick, and of course, our hosting partner, IT Direct. Like everyone in the aviation industry, the New England Air Museum has had to do a pivot, and these business after hours events, in addition to the sponsorships, are also supported by ticket sales. Since we are not having a live event tonight at the museum, our sponsors stepped in and supported this event for us, and we really do appreciate their generosity. If you're able to support this event tonight with a small donation in lieu of a ticket, please feel free to see our website at www.neam.org. And although the doors of the museum are locked for right now, the museum is definitely open. Like everyone, we're turning to a virtual world in order to accomplish our mission to preserve, engage, and inspire. And through our NEAM at Home program, we're providing online content to engage our audiences like we are tonight. We continue to design and progress several exciting new exhibits, including one celebrating New England women in aviation. And our Store for Science program is providing resources to teachers to provide really interesting lessons for students as they do their at-home schooling. So again, thank you for joining us tonight. I hope you're able to come visit the New England Air Museum soon and that life gets back to some semblance of normalcy for all of us. And with that, I'd like to introduce fellow board member Bob Stangeron.
Well, thank you, Scott, and good evening, everyone. I hope you're doing well in these challenging times. I'm really honored to be able to introduce Richard this evening. Richard and I have been really good friends for many years, and I can say without reservation that he's positioned at the very top of the ranking when it comes to analysts in the aerospace and defense industry. Before I tell you about his background, I must say that Richard and I have had a long-standing tradition of having a cocktail to start off our periodic dinners together with our wives, Casey and Caroline. This is my preference. It's a Rob Roy, and I suspect Richard has his favorite drink close at hand. So here's to you, Richard, and thank you for sharing your wisdom with us tonight. Professionally, Richard is pretty much right out of central casting for the role he plays in the industry. He is currently VP of Analysis at Teal Group, and he edits their World Military and Civil Aircraft Briefing, which is a highly respected forecasting tool used by a plethora of companies, governments, and think tanks. You'll see him frequently on just about all the networks, and he's a regular contributing columnist to both Aviation Week and Fortune. He has a master's degree in war studies from King's College of the University of London and a bachelor's degree from George Washington University. Before joining Teal, he worked at Jane's Information Group, where he analyzed the jet engine market. And typically in non-virus times, he was rarely at his home in Washington, normally traveling worldwide for both business and pleasure. So I think it'll be very interesting to hear how he's doing under this new confinement. Richard, I hope all is well with you and your family, and we're very much looking forward to what insights you have in store for us today. Thanks very much for being with us. Cheers.
Cheers. It's great to be here, Bob, and can't thank you enough for the warm introduction. And yes, joining you with another Scotch-based beverage, Scotch. And I can't thank enough the New England Air Museum for hosting me in this event. You know, the original plan, of course, was for me to come up there, spend a great evening in the museum, and then have dinner afterwards with well, Bob and Caroline. And you know, I'll begin my presentation on a high note. Matter of fact, my objective tonight is to begin and to end on a high note. I promise you that. The stuff in the middle, maybe not so much, but that's what Scotch is for, right? We'll get through it. But the high note to start with is a lot of questions. A lot of people ask me a question I think on everyone's mind these days: will there be a normal when all of this is over? What happens? We're living in a world of Zoom and GoToWebinars and whatever else. We got to get used to it and live a virtual life. And oh my God, I mean, we've had decades to perfect this technology. Some of it's pretty good. I got to say, this is nice, but it just isn't the same. The idea that we would give up the lives we enjoyed and do this, it's just inconceivable to me. And I think it's not anything that, you know, you look back at the history of aviation business development, how the market has progressed over the years. There's no evidence that better telecoms has ever had an impact on travel demand. And I don't think it's going to start. When we recover from this disaster, we will resume exactly where we were and resume that growth rate, because people still want to get together and have a nice dinner and a cocktail, and in an ideal world, a walk around a fantastic museum where they've got really cool planes. So again, I'll conclude on a happy note, but let's get to the maybe not so fantastic stuff. Let's see here.
It's always so easy in the dry run, isn't it?
It really is, isn't it? Goodness. Every time I open
Thinking
PDF,
the same thing, Scott.
There we go. Okay. And share screen. Well, let's see. It looks like I have to hit that first. There we go. All right. Let's just do it this way. Is that a good view for people?
Yeah, I think we can see it, Richard. You might want to you might want to full screen it though. Yeah, there you go.
Right.
Go to view.
Okay.
Yep, and then full screen mode. There you go. There you go.
Anyway, here we are.
No worries.
Right. Let's get on with it. First of all, when we look at the current situation, remember, it's not just the COVID disaster, the pandemic. It's a whole host of other things that have hit us simultaneously. And it's kind of funny, about 3-4 years ago, I was traveling with my family in Nova Scotia and went to a zoo there, and I happened to see a couple of black swans. And after all these years of discussing the risks of black swans in this industry, I thought, well, better take a photo in case I need it. And the truth is, I should have taken a picture of more than two. I think there were a few of them, because right now we're being hit by a bit of a flock. In addition to the COVID disaster, we've also got a fuel price shock for reasons that really aren't clear to anybody. The Saudis and the Russians have chosen to fight a fuel price war exactly when a recession was imminent. That's played havoc with this industry on many different levels. Another shock is the recession that's inevitably going to result when, of course, all of this economic activity is stopped. Another shock you already had last year, and you'll see this in one of my slides in a moment, a de-link of air travel demand from economics. There were a couple of reasons for that, but that's another shock to our system. And then on top of that, after years of, having China as a major catalyst for growth in this industry, all of a sudden, both China has, decelerated in its economic growth, and this is before COVID-19, and at the same time, increasing tensions between China and the West have threatened China as an aerospace market for Western products. So a bunch of things are happening here, all of which are impacting the market. Now, naturally, when you have a shock to the system like this, you go back in time and try to figure out how things are different relative to the last exogenous shock that impacted our business. And a few things are different this time. First of all, the magnitude. You'll see that in a moment in my numbers. On the positive side, airlines are in better shape. That's good. Another positive is that governments are being more aggressive, so far at least. We'll see if their financial bandwidth begins to wear thin if this goes on for too long. But right now, the government response, particularly in the US, but also elsewhere, hasn't been bad at all. On the negative side, we just can't stimulate our way out of this with cheap cash. Interest rates are already as low as they could be. And then finally, you look at what happened to this business after the last shock to the system, which of course was the great economic meltdown in 2008. We actually saw jetliner market demand accelerate afterwards due to a weird combination of unusual factors. You had a bifurcation between the cost of capital and the cost of fuel. You had emerging markets that really kicked in. None of these things are in play today. And then finally, the last thing that I think we need to think about moving forward is what role state aid is going to play. Because frankly, when you provide, tens of billions of dollars for the manufacture of aircraft, as is very likely, you're creating a synthetic market that kind of pulls demand forward, and that's something to think about. Now, one more chart to discuss before we move on to some numbers here. Be very suspicious if anyone offers you a scenario here that doesn't take into account the unique epidemiology of COVID-19. Basically, before we have any kind of conversation about an air travel recovery and then a jetliner demand recovery, we have to discuss how this disease plays out. And I've talked to an awful lot of people over the past 6 weeks. It's been, I'm sure we all have. I've talked to a lot of people in the biological sciences, the medical field, and no one seems to know, but it seems like a vaccine, and a reliable one, and its administration and distribution is probably about 2 years away. Now, it's possible that we're going to have effective post-infection therapeutic drugs available before then, but that's really not enough to get people feeling very comfortable about flying in the numbers they had been flying. There's also the likelihood of repeated outbreaks. If you look at that chart I've got there, courtesy of the Eurasia Group, you had China first, US, Europe second, and we could very well see a third hump, which is even more devastating in the developing world, particularly India and Latin America, and many other places. So there's a lot of risk moving forward. In terms of our planning, our market expectation, I think a reasonable level of guidance is that we get some kind of upward L or a U-shaped recovery, and it takes about 2.5, 3 years, and we get back to the peak, the 2019 peak of air traffic demand in 2023. But the most important thing to remember is this isn't a V. I cannot think of a medical rationale that, and all the people I've discussed, that would make this a V-shaped recovery. This is going to take time, a lot longer than usual. And that's what makes it, I think, potentially uniquely painful in the experience of our business. Like I said, I started on good news. I'm going to finish on good news, and the stuff in between, not so much. So let's look where we've come from in terms of the market segments in our business. As you can see, the bottom line is in the peak year last year, 180 billion in deliveries. The single-aisle jetliners actually, of course, took a real hit with the MAX situation. You can see that in the 2018 to 2019 numbers. We weren't in the best shape, to be honest, because of that. Very few segments were actually growing. The only segment that was truly healthy was combat aircraft, which grew by 26% last year. That's good. But even business aircraft, which superficially exhibited a decent growth rate last year, a lot of that was just a handful of Gulfstreams and Bombardier Globals that weren't great from a total tail number standpoint, but were excellent from a value standpoint. In other words, people bought a couple dozen $100 million business jets, and that pumped up the value of the market. We were not in the best shape for a variety of reasons. Now, what are we expecting in terms of fallout? I'm going to walk you through a lot of these. The people who get hit the first and hardest and the longest, twin-aisle jets, because international traffic is getting hit the hardest and the longest. When we do have an air travel recovery, it's going to be in domestic markets where people feel relatively comfortable. No one is out there planning the big anniversary trip to Thailand or anything like that. They just want to go see their aunt in Des Moines, or they want to go take a business trip to a client in Chicago or something like that. It's going to be domestic markets. International markets are going to stay depressed for longer. And you already had an overcapacity situation in the twin-aisle market segment. And on top of that, there is a broader secular shift underway away from twin aisles and towards single aisles. I'll show you a chart that speaks to that in a moment. Now, second to get hit is going to be single aisle jets for the simple reason that the appeal of taking on a new generation aircraft like a MAX or a NEO heavily depends upon, well, you caring about the price of fuel as an airline. And right now, the price of fuel, of course, is due to an incredibly bizarre anomaly. This week went into negative territory. That means you have to pay to avoid the shipment of fuel. That's obviously not sustainable. That's a weird moment in economic time, but it does speak to the complete collapse in demand in the world economy, and of course the oversupply of oil in the world economy. The third to get hit, business jets. You know, demand for large cabin business jets is closely correlated with that price of oil. Basically, a lot of the customer base for larger jets comes from resource-rich economies and resource-rich countries. Small and medium cabin business jets, while demand there is closely correlated with equities, indices, and corporate profits. Both of those, as we know, are taking a hit or about to take a hit along with the broader economy. The fourth thing to get hit, civil rotorcraft, because of course, in the large cabin segment there, you have a close linkage between the oil and gas market, which of course is going to take a long time to resume investment in capital equipment for looking for oil that nobody in the world needs today. Now, good news, military programs. As far as I can tell, they're in really great shape, and everyone I speak with seems to think that's going to stay that way. Certainly in the US, The view of the defense budget is that it is a perfect place to put shovel-ready stimulus cash. In other words, if anything, we could see an upside for defense spending in the U.S. The only country I know that has even remotely discussed defense spending cuts is South Korea, because of course they were hit pretty hard by this and had to divert some of the cash. But nobody else seems to think there'll be a linkage. And, you know, quite frankly, when people are shelling out trillions of dollars in necessary government support for industry, for the broader world industry, and the US especially, well, then frankly, spending $170 billion in the US on defense procurement doesn't really move the needle. It just isn't something you would go after as a budget cutter. Now let's talk about the big commercial jet market, because of course that's far and away the biggest segment of the business. And you look at the history of this industry, it's kind of a weird story. We had always had cyclicality. It had generally been 7 good years, 3 bad years, repeat forever. But between 2004 and 2018, we enjoyed a 14-year super cycle. The only reason that didn't keep going into 2019 was because of the MAX grounding and the MAX production halt. So we were already kind of in uncharted turf. Now, bit of good news here, we're in a much higher place than in all of our previous economic bust cycles, our previous cyclical bust cycles. So superficially, percentages might look bad, but really we're talking about maybe falling back to, say, the year 2010. It'll hurt, but on the other hand, this is a much bigger industry than it's been in the past. Let's talk about traffic for a moment. We'd already had a very strange situation last year. Historically, there's been a pretty close linkage between economic growth, GDP, and revenue passenger kilometers, passenger traffic demand. And last year, it kind of broke down. You know, last year was a perfectly good year from the standpoint of economic growth, but RPKs only grew by 4.2% year over year, compared to, say, 2018, which saw 6.5% growth. And as far as I could tell, the primary cause of last year's slowdown was China. Chinese economic growth, reported or unreported, fell precipitously, probably to the 2 or 3% range. They just weren't talking about it. And that brought Chinese air travel growth down from 12.2% to 5.3% at the end of the year. All of Asia, too, was hit also by a bit of deglobalization that might have affected Asia a bit more than others. But having said that, you know, 4.2% RPKs last year, that's enviable now. You know, the numbers are shocking. Traffic right now in the US is down 96%. We think worldwide it's 90 to 95%. IATA numbers for February are only down about 15, as you can see on the right-hand side of the chart, but that's just the start of some really serious trouble here. Nothing good is going on, as you all know. Turning to the next page, you look to the right. This is the history of world air traffic through most of the jet age. And the thing I would point out is that we have never seen anything like this. Even the really bad years, like you can see 9/11, we lost about 3 points of growth that year. Other years, like for example, 91, Gulf War I, SARS, you can see there around 2007, 2008, all of these were 1 or 2 point drops. Well, here we are, we're now down 95%. IATA is telling us that it's going to be down 48%, resulting in that really ominous drop on the right-hand side of the chart. IATA does a great job, but I got to tell you, I'm a little concerned because that 48% number is predicated upon an incredible fourth quarter comeback. And again, given the absence of a vaccine right now, given the absence of a compelling reason that people should feel, well, enthusiastic about getting back on a jet without all kinds of precautions, that 48% number seems a little unrealistic. That isn't good. We could have an industry this year that is effectively cut in half or more until we see that kind of effective post-therapeutic remedy or before there's a vaccine. And aftermarket, that's even worse, because when you talk about aftermarket, you typically begin with the fall off in capacity, and then you go with the add-on effect of, well, destocking, of greater availability of used and serviceable materials, any deferred discretionary maintenance and upgrades. You could be talking about an aftermarket environment that's down 75, 80% this year. And also speaking to that, look at the other chart. Look at that, the percentage of the fleet that's parked has now hit about 2/3. Again, something we've never seen. Typically about 10% of the fleet is somewhere and, rotating or, in between owners or maybe waiting to be parted out or something. And now here we are at about 65%, probably heading a little higher. That's not good at all. So numbers like these are completely out of whack with anything we've seen in the history of this business. Paul Krugman in the Times had a terrifying quote. Basically, he said, the world economy is kind of in a medically induced coma right now. And the air travel industry very much reflects that painful reality. You're starting to see economists talk about a GDP drop in the US of 40% this year, being quite conceivable. This, of course, rivals the numbers that our parents and grandparents saw in the Great Depression. So truly shocking times here, I'm afraid. As you can see on the next page, lower utilization can help with overcapacity, typically in tough times when traffic growth falls, like as you can see in the year of 9/11, the SARS year and Gulf War I, utilization falls with it, but utilization cuts can only do so much for you when you've got traffic numbers like this. So as a result, frankly, even if you have retirements ramp up to 1,000 jets a year, which I think you have to see is at a bare minimum, there's no case to be building more than about that. And frankly, even a lot of those are going to get parked next year. This year and next year are going to be really bumpy. Next page, please. One of the big drivers behind the last upturn was that split between the cost of cash and the cost of fuel. You want an environment where airlines feel motivated to take on new, more fuel-efficient equipment and, of course, access to cheap cash with which to do it. From our industry standpoint, this crisis is having kind of a weird effect. Oil is quickly falling, of course, to possibly as low as 15 to 20 per barrel on a sustainable basis, let alone, let's not talk about the weird anomaly this week. And interest rates, they're probably going to hover near zero for some time. This is not a good environment. Next page, please. You can see the impact of China's slowing growth last year. One of my big concerns is that when we have a recovery from these very difficult times, China might not be there the way it has been in the past for us. And whenever there's some kind of political fight between China and the West, I just cringe, because I understand the geopolitical tension between China and the West. I understand why a lot of Western politicians are angry. And however, from the standpoint of our industry in the past, they have been absolutely essential in fueling our industry's recovery. They went from just 2% of the market in 2000 to 23% at their peak in 2018. So that's going to be something else you want to keep a close eye on. You can see here that, well, book to bill is no longer a thing. If we get off with, say, 1,000 net orders this year, that is to say, about 1,000 cancellations and no new net orders or no new gross orders, I think we'll be lucky. It's going to take a few years back before we get back to anything acceptable in terms of a decent book-to-bill ratio. Here's where Teal Group was in its projections at the start of the year, and Boy, I long for those days. I think it was around then I started planning my trip to the New England Air Museum with a confident expectation, being able to join friends with a drink. Didn't look bad. A bit of overcapacity in the twin aisle market, leading to a plateaued decade. The 737 MAX problem, of course, created that nasty dent in the single aisle line, but we had a pretty good feeling it would be back. Here's where we are now. We're in for a very painful fall, primarily with twin aisles. That market is basically being cut in half. And it's going to take till, well, about 2023, 24 till we see a meaningful recovery. The situation with single aisles, not quite as dire. Part of it is that Boeing is in kind of the weird position of having to go from nothing to something. Airbus, of course, have announced a cut from 60 per month on their single aisles to 40 per month. You're going to see another cut there. But Boeing, of course, is at zero. Sometime later this year, in the second half, they're going to get to 20 per month. They got to use those machines, quite frankly. And I think they just need to start satisfying their contractual obligations and whatever else. So assuming a return to service sometime around, say, September, you'll probably see a production resumption in the late third quarter, somewhere around there. And that'll make things a little better than they would have been on the single aisle market. And you'll start to see some better single aisle numbers in the 22, 23 area, depending on how quickly we get traffic back. Again, this is all predicated upon a vaccine and traffic getting back to peak as a consequence of that vaccine somewhere in the 2023 timeframe. Now, one big shift in the market that we're seeing is towards single aisles, and the number one beneficiary of this is the A321neo. To everybody who's now retiring an older twin aisle jet, the best thing they can do is to replace that with a single aisle, and the most capable one right out there now is the 321neo. I think Boeing needs to do something here. It is absolutely essential. This chart assumes that they don't, that very simply this becomes an Airbus 60%, then a 65%, and maybe 70% market within 10 years. Watch Boeing very carefully. I understand that they're under a great deal of financial stress, but if they don't prioritize new product development and the preservation of their aircraft design teams, there's a real risk here of permanently, or for a very long time anyway, ceding market leadership to Airbus because of this A321neo. Also, business jets, just a quick word about that. As I mentioned, there's a close correlation between the top half of the market, those large cabin jets, and oil prices, because of a lot of customers coming from resource-rich economies and energy extraction corporations. So that's being hit pretty hard relative to where we expected to be. The bottom half of the market, the small and mid-cabin planes, they're hit too, but not nearly as severely, we hope, in part because they never got to the kind of crazy frothiness you saw in order book and production plans back in 2007, 2008. So here again, we're possibly at the benefit of not having gotten to the same crazy peaks. Civil rotorcraft, this too is going to be a hit courtesy of oil and gas again. And well, that large cabin segment, that's going to be hit for a little longer, but pretty much all segments are going to be hit. Here's what we're expecting this year. This year, there's a certain degree of coverage because a lot of airlines have their finance plans lined up. Maybe they've got sale and leaseback transaction plans already lined up. But even there, we're looking at a total industry drop of 17% before it gets, frankly, considerably worse in 2021. But this could get worse this year. We don't know. Part of it, of course, depends upon, well, how quickly factories reopen, whether or not there's any risk in the supply chain, either financial risk or COVID-19 risk. There's a lot of risk to this. But either way, you can assume this is a kind of optimistic base scenario. it's still an unpleasant 17% cut. What does this do to our 10-year forecast for everything? Well, we're leaving our military forecast uncut. If anything, there could be an upside there, but civil, oh boy. That red line was where we were in January, and the green line is where we are in April right now. And basically, we're falling back to where we were around 2009, 2010. That's a very painful process. As I began, I said that we were going to get back to where we were, and we were going to resume our long-term growth rate because I believe in international travel. And I still believe that, and this chart reflects that. But for about 3 years, we're in for a really bumpy ride. And that, I'm afraid, is the bad news. And I promised to give you a little bit of good news to pick you up at the end of this presentation, starting and ending with good news. And here it is. Let me walk you through a few positive things that I've been thinking about while I have a hit of scotch. First of all, it's a much bigger industry. Like I said before, you know, if you've got a $40 billion industry that takes a 30% cut, yeah, you've got a $28 billion industry. If you're a $110 billion industry that takes a 40% cut, you know, you're still a 60-something billion dollar a year industry. That's a better place to be. That's kind of a happy thought, I guess. What's kind of a really weird, anomalous happy thought is if you're in the airline business, you're living in what you might call a near paradise, everything except the traffic. Yes, traffic is down 95%, but wow, from an airline standpoint, your fuel is cheaper than you ever could have imagined it. Your jets, well, you can get any equipment you want, brand new practically, at a heavily discounted price. Your crew costs, well, let's just say they're not about to push back on wages anytime soon. Interest rates, well, they're staying at zero. Government intervention, yes, for most for now. This is a dream world from an airline industry perspective, except for traffic. So when traffic starts to come back, they can do one or two things. One, they can help stimulate our way out of this with cheaper than ever fares, or they can hold the line on pricing and try to restore profit, or a combination. The point is there's some latitude to restore this industry to health when there is a solution to this terrible pandemic by way of a vaccine. The airlines will be in good shape. Obviously, there's a lot of risk getting to that point in terms of surviving this terrible traffic environment. But in terms of all the other factors that go into running the airline business, they're in really good shape. Defense budgets and export demand, very strong. Also, defense industrial support. You know, DOD and a lot of other military agencies worldwide are looking at the impact to the industrial base of this commercial disaster, and they're looking to see how they can help with advance payments to suppliers and other mechanisms. And they're going to keep doing that. And this gets to another subject. For companies, it's all about balance. New England's biggest aerospace company is, of course, now something called Raytheon Technologies. A fascinating creation. If we had had a conversation about creating Raytheon Technologies, I would have, a year ago, I would have advised the people of Raytheon to look to the commercial market for long-term growth. And I would have advised the people at United Technologies to look to Raytheon for military stability. UTX, wow, this couldn't have been timed better. Raytheon, maybe this couldn't have been timed worse. Either way, you now have a very well-balanced company for the long run. But it's kind of interesting to think about its creation and the thinking that went into it. The financial sector is a lot stronger moving into this crisis than it has been before. You look back in 2008, a lot of the problem was nobody being able to get credit or financing. And it took some work by the part of governments and central banks and international financial agencies like IMF and World Bank to restore stability. But this time things are a bit better. There's a lot of dry powder, a lot of cash on the sidelines that could ease our problem, especially if the lessors get the money that they need to basically ride this out and play the long-term game. And they'll be rewarded for that if they play the long-term game. Because again, I believe that in this industry, we will see a solid long-term recovery. Again, it's just going to take some time. There's a lot less business jet frothiness. You compare this with 2008, there's nothing like the same sort of business jet flipping and speculative order books that we saw back then. Good news, Connecticut, your flagship products are really well positioned. You know, the Pure Power turbofan from Pratt & Whitney is in great shape. That A321neo that I showed you is one of the big successes of this industry, and probably one of the ones that's least likely to get hit by a shock from this tragedy. And of course makes use of the GTF and the Blackhawk. No risk at all to the Blackhawk. So Connecticut's flagship products are in great shape. Another bit of good news, if anything good comes out of this tragedy, I think it's going to remind people that, you know what, it's fun to talk about going it alone, but it's important to think globally. The way to get through this crisis, it's an international cooperation. It's working with other health agencies. Everyone needs to cooperate. And this has never been more true in the aerospace industry. Matter of fact, take you back to one of Connecticut's flagship products. The geared turbofan is, I believe, unique in America. It's the only major engine program to not have application on an American jet. It is solely exposed to international platforms. In our business, it's always been, you got to think global. And in the case of New England, you know, you got to act regionally, but think globally. I guess that's the major way to think about it. And with that, I thank you so much for coming to this virtual event. I'm going to turn back over to Ron for some Q&A, but thank you.
Thanks, Richard. That was a great presentation. We really appreciate your insights. Ari and I are going to run through some questions. We have several that have come in already, but we certainly encourage people to continue using that question tab on their screen. If you think of additional questions, please send them in. I'm going to start off with one that came in from our good friend here in Connecticut, Max Flight, good friend of the New England Air Museum, and runs the podcast called Airplane Geeks. Thanks for being on with us tonight, Max. His question is, Richard, what can you say about the relative recovery trajectory of the airframers, engine OEMs, and component manufacturers? He also wants to know if that's his microphone you're using.
First of all, Max, congratulations on the, my God, what was it? 800, 1,000 just the other night? What a tremendous podcast record. And great to hear your voice filtered through Ron, of course. But and yes, as a matter of fact, this is one you generously gave to me for one of our many podcasts. And well, thank you. Works great. All right, who's best positioned for trajectory? You know, a lot of it depends upon whether you take the long view or not. I think for people in the financial sector who take the long view, the lesser sector, I think they're going to be in pretty good shape. It's just that, of course, heavily dependent upon being able to ride out this event. Now, the problem with being an engine maker, of course, is that you are heavily dependent upon the aftermarket for a big chunk of your profits. So you're going to get hit really, well, heavily in conjunction with utilization. The good news is that when destocking runs its course, when utilization begins to rise, maybe you're first in line to benefit from that. I would imagine that's probably the case. In terms of the primes, you know, they might be among the last, frankly, because it's going to take a long time to mop up the surplus production. In terms of the subs, you know, it's all about that portfolio. The ones who have heavy military exposure are going to be best positioned. The ones who are pure play commercial, well, of course, they're exactly in line with what the primes give them. So this is going to be difficult across the board. You look at it from the standpoint of just the next 3 years as being a very difficult story. And well, it's frankly hard to identify any leaders or laggards. It's just hard.
All right, Richard, we got another one here from our friend William Alderman. First, he wants to congratulate you on a great presentation. And then the next question is, what is your advice for independent MROs focused on commercial passenger aircraft to weather the downturn you've talked about between now and 2023?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. It's good to hear your voice indirectly too. Boy, I mean, obviously getting as diverse as possible and globalizing as much as possible, that's something I would have said years ago, and hopefully a lot of them have done that because, of course, it's all about your portfolio. Is it time to consider more mergers and acquisitions in this industry? Absolutely. You don't want to restructure at the point of a gun. On the other hand, critical mass more important than ever. Keeping things as lean as possible, and being able to ride it out and being aggressive on price with the expectation of capturing long-term share. I know it sounds difficult and painful, but that's about what I got from a third-party MRO standpoint.
Richard, next question comes from Paul Finkelstein over at Pratt & Whitney. Paul asks that he notes that individual airlines are trying to establish safety procedures on their own now, and wonders if there should be a more global entity overseeing that to avoid competing safety procedures between airlines. And if so, who should take the lead? Who's the right agency for something like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Good to hear you from you, Paul. One of my big concerns is that this industry has had a code, a very well observed code of not competing on safety. It cheapens things for everybody, and thankfully it hasn't happened in decades, many decades. However, this would appear to be a kind of risk. You start talking about additional seat pitch, additional, some magic fluid in the HEPA filters, God knows what. You're running the risk of competing on safety here, and I don't want that. What I think we should do is work to establish exactly what you suggest there, Paul. Some kind of industry-wide standards that say, here's what you adhere to. We all abide by that. We're all safer together, and we don't advertise that we are exceeding them. We simply say, this is what we're doing to make it safe along with everybody else in the business. Now, who leads that charge? Is it ICAO? Is it IATA? Is it Airlines for America working in conjunction with their partner organizations in Europe and elsewhere? I really don't know. I would argue, make this as ecumenical as possible. Build a big raft, as our Buddhist friends say. You got to get as many buy-ins as possible to this idea. And even just doing that, I think, helps establish credibility among the flying public that the best people are on this, and nobody is not adhering to extremely rigid standards of safety as we begin to fly again.
All right, you want to turn your mic on?
There you go. That'd be helpful, wouldn't it? We have from our friend Eric Brenton. We've got, what do you see for airline consolidation and LCC future in the U.S. and worldwide, Richard?
Yeah, there's a couple possibilities here, a couple things to think about. One is, assuming we are going for an extended period where governments are called upon to provide life support for airlines. Let's say it's not 3 or 4 months. Let's say it's 9 months or something. What are the odds that they're going to prioritize a couple of national champions and flag carriers and key hub and spoke carriers? 100%. You're already starting to see signs of this. Obviously, Virgin Australia going bust. You're going to see a real risk to others too. And for some, it's good news. Like Alitalia will, bizarrely enough, survive as a nationalized creation, it turns out. But for a lot of these ULCCs, they might not have that kind of government preference. And it's worse than that. If you're imagining a world where for a long time they can't sell middle seats and the maximum load factor is 66% for domestic routes, and seat pitch has to go up and nobody can compete with a, I don't know, 26-inch seat pitch or something crazy like that, then, oh boy, a lot of the competitive differentiation for ULCC goes away fast too. So I don't know what to do to survive in those circumstances. It could just be that we're going to have some ULCC casualties, because that's a place where mergers, they don't appear to make a great deal of sense. I think you just pray for a fast recovery and a fast vaccine that allows you to get back to high density, low cost travel, but they would appear to be among the biggest potential casualties of this process.
Thanks, Richard. The next question is from Andrew Mayer. You haven't mentioned anything about the Airbus A220 series. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm actually a big believer in the 220. Thank you for asking. For the same reasons, I'm kind of a big believer in the 321neo. I think for all airlines, survival for a time, at least in probably 4 or 5 years, is going to be about getting small. And so whatever equipment has the equivalent economics and functionality of the larger equipment wins. So for the 321neo, it's got, frankly, a lot of the range and even better seat mile costs of, say, a 767 or an older A330 or a 777-200ER that it's replacing. Maybe not all the range, but a lot of it for transatlantic routes. It's going to win. Similarly, for the A220, I think it's going to be a really nice fit for a lot of US and intra-European carriers that are looking to replace older 73s and A320s with equivalent range and better seat mile economics. So we haven't really changed our A220 numbers very much, except for what Airbus has said. They're delaying the ramp a little bit, but we still see it getting back to its trajectory up to 10 per month within 4 years or so. It's still going to be a very big success. Still a big believer in that plane.
Thanks, Richard. From our good friend Scott Ashton, we have a question. What do you think the prospects are for the AW609 tilt rotor?
Oh boy, yeah, a 25-year road, maybe 30. I've lost track. This doesn't help, right? I mean, oil and gas has always been part of its market. With the 609, it's always been just a question of whether or not Leonardo would kind of lose patience. They've claimed 70 orders for a very long time now, a couple of high-profile ones from the UAE and a couple of others. Does this event merely cause them to lose patience? I don't know. Between, when they were with Bell, they stuck with it. Now, of course, they've been on their own for about a decade. They've stuck with it. Oh boy, a lot of risk. We haven't removed it from our forecast. We still have it in at about 10 per year. It's a real niche requirement. The whole idea of paying, basically $25 million for something with a $11 million cabin or a $10 million cabin. So a lot of risk, but no change to our forecast yet.
Well, we're getting a lot of questions in, so we'll try to make it through as many of them as we can. But I'm looking at the list, and we may not make it to everybody's, but we'll do our best. Richard, any thoughts on the tie-up between Boeing and Embraer after this is all over?
Oh boy, that's a great question. The broken deal fee is $100 million, which makes this relatively easy to get out of from Boeing's standpoint. That means since it's a $4.2 billion deal, by spending $100 million, they still get $4.1 billion in instant liquidity by getting rid of that deal. Having said that, Embraer is a great company. It would give Boeing access to something new that it doesn't have on its waterfront and help secure the alliance it's got on the military side of the house too, even though that's not part of the JV. So I understand most of the strategic rationale from Boeing's standpoint. However, on the other hand, the the countervailing view is, hey, $4.1 billion in a time when everyone's screaming for liquidity. So I'd have to average it all out to like, yeah, 55% chance it still goes ahead. But before this, it was an 85% chance. I think a lot of it will, revolve around Boeing's financing moving forward. Right now, the company has about 14 billion in cash and access to another 9.7 or something in its revolver. Big variable, whether or not the government provides loans or loan guarantees or stock warrants or some other form of assistance. And well, basically the big question then is, if things get difficult, do they need that 4.1 billion? Now, yesterday, the European Union said they were going to wait until August to approve it. And I guess ironically, that's probably good for Boeing. It might give them a bit of breathing room to see how things shape out. August 7th was the day. So to answer your question is, hey, let's meet again on August 7th, see how things look on the Boeing finance front, and go from there.
Fair enough. Looking at the next question, what's your position on Rolls-Royce? Our questioner says doesn't look so well positioned compared to Pratt and Whitney. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I've been writing about Rolls-Royce and their weaknesses for years now, and they haven't exactly gone into this under the strongest of circumstances. It's still a great company from an engineering standpoint, from a heritage company. But when they backed out of the International Aero Engines Consortium, they bet entirely on the twin aisle market. And right now, from that perspective, that appears to have been a really bad bet. Now, you still have this weird situation where the world's best possible aerospace merger is between Pratt and Whitney and Rolls-Royce. Together, they would be 50% of the market, facing off against GE with 50% of the market. And all of Pratt is single aisles, and all of Rolls is single aisles, is twin aisles. So very synergistic, really great from an M&A standpoint. The creation of Raytheon Technologies would seem to rule that out because, of course, it would be too overwhelmingly huge for the UK government to permit Rolls. But part of me is still holding out hope that maybe, just maybe, RTX decides that Pratt and Whitney is its own unique and wonderful beast, and just decides, well, do a deal, create this big new transatlantic engine prime. Rolls and Pratt merged together, spun off from RTX. The mechanics of doing that are fiendishly difficult, to say nothing of the transatlantic politics of doing that. But as an abstract concept, it would appear to solve all of Rolls-Royce's very many problems.
Richard, I've got two questions here from Bill Lee of the Lee Company, and he labels them one easy and one hard. So I'll give you the easy one first.
The easy one.
His intention is that you can take a sip of your drink in between the two. So the easy question is, your projection for 2020 is 17%. What about 2021?
Yeah. Was that the hard one or the easy one?
Oh, well, he said it was easy, so.
He said it was easy. Yeah. Bill, it's great to hear from you. Hope you're still wearing the Lee Company tie at home. I think we've got an additional cut somewhere. I'll have to eyeball it from one of our charts here, but I think it's down another 15 or 20. It's a significant drop. Might be on an additional 20% range. So it's not pretty, not good. I mean, the trough year is 2022. 21 and 22 being basically bad trough years. Mm-hmm. So I think it's something on the order of 20, I want to say. But anyway, and now I brace myself for the hard question. Excuse me.
So the hard one, why and when will 737 MAX restart production?
Yeah, when you get that return to service, hopefully later this year, restarting production is just the start of it, because of course you've got 387 aircraft in airline hands that pretty quickly go back. Another 350 or so that are built but not delivered, that will presumably be delivered sometime in the following 18 months. And then, of course, the minimum economic rate of building the plane, probably at about 20 per month, that being a good minimum economic number. So this is, you know, a lot of planes, a lot of capacity that the market really doesn't need right now. I think the product begins to lose credibility if it doesn't return to service. And the company does have to think in terms of product credibility. So in other words, it would be great to have a controlled flip-on switch, but in terms of the chain of events set off by that return to service, there's no avoiding it. I mean, it's just a recipe for a lot more parked aircraft. Another problem I'm told by people who are smarter on production lines than me is you got to start using the Brogy machines and everything like that. Just firing blanks doesn't do it. You got to actually restart production just from the standpoint of keeping the machines from wearing out. I'll take these people very seriously. They seem to know their business. So for all these reasons, like them or not, they're coming back online.
Richard, you had mentioned that the Black Hawk helicopter is not in any trouble. Question here is, can you explain why?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. Bit of a soapbox of mine, really. The Future Vertical Lift program, which is designed to create an all-encompassing new vertical flight architecture for the Army and other services, to me, was really flawed from the word go because they didn't look at the economics of it. And they were trying to create a single architecture that would basically feed into all Cape sets. The first Cape set is going to be the Scout Attack Replacement. That's going to replace the Kiowa Warrior. And I think the FARA program, Future Attack Reconnaissance Aircraft, that's going to go ahead. The next Cape set under FVL is FLRAA, the Future Long Range Assault Aircraft. And you look at that, that's trickier. With FARA, you really do get performance enhancements associated with, say, well, let's maybe the SB-1, the Raider Defiant design, or an alternative design, maybe the Invictus from Bell, but whatever. Reconfiguring your helicopter really does give you some interesting performance advantages. Whereas with FLRAA, you're paying a lot more to buy. Probably, if the V-22 is any guide, at least a 100%. Let's be optimistic and say they can get that down to 75% more relative to a $20 million Black Hawk Mike model. So you're paying for range and speed, but most Army missions for a Black Hawk are like maybe 50 or 100 miles. They don't need range or speed the way the Marines do. So my feeling is that FLRAA becomes a Marine program, and the Marines wind up paying for it. Maybe Special Operations Command gets some too. But for the Army, the idea of swapping out 2,000 Black Hawks of all models, Ls, Ms, Vs, and paying for what will likely be a $30 to $40 million machine with its higher operating costs, that's just a budget destroyer. I just don't see it happening as an economics guy who likes, you know, the combat side of the business. I don't really think the people on the combat side have looked at it from an economic standpoint. And on top of that, you have the usual degree of technological maturation that's required to make this all new architecture happening. I think Black Hawk is pretty safe well through the 2030s. That's my professional estimate.
Let's hope so. We've got a quick comment and then another question. This is from Darius Cania from Lynn Welding. He says, Richard, he's your #1 fan and looks forward to your market reports. Know that somebody out there is. I'm going to skip ahead to a question that's a little bit different. Now, Ken Katz from Collins Aerospace asks, you're bullish on military expenditures. The U.S. entered this epidemic with $23 trillion of federal debt. It'll be $30 trillion when we're done with this. And military spending is not driving the debt, but as a political matter, social entitlement spending won't be cut unless military spending is cut. How do you see American federal debt fitting into the projections in terms of on the military spending side?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think all of us tax-paying citizens are a little concerned about what's going on. You already had $1 trillion budget deficit before this crisis, and obviously it's so much worse. The only thing I can tell you, the reason I think we'll be able to ride it out and find some kind of long-term solution rather than a short-term budget cut solution, is that everyone else is doing it too. Even financially conservative Germany is planning a $1 trillion stimulus package. Japan, which had way exceeded any debt to GDP ratio you could imagine for the US, is also finding $1 trillion. Everyone is stimulating their way out of this. So in other words, from the standpoint of the US dollar, it's not just that we're the reserve currency, it's also that we're staying still in relative terms. We're not, the anomalous Weimar Republic Germany that's risking hyperinflation because the printing machines are working overtime printing banknotes. Everyone is doing exactly the same thing, and we're staying in relative terms pretty strong, or relative terms on par, which is why the dollar is still strangely just fine. In the long run, yes, we do face exactly the kind of challenges you think about, but in the midterm, because we're all in the same boat as the rest of the globe, we have time to figure it out. So I guess that's the time-honored cry from Washington, ask again in 5 years. But still, it means that for the next few years, on the defense side, we're okay.
So Richard, I'm going to throw in actually one of my own questions, which is, are there any historical analogies that you think could help us understand the aerospace impact of the U.S.-China tensions, or what the impact on the industry those tensions might have? And as sort of a backup to that, is there any economy or group of economies like India, Africa, Middle East that might be able to replace China's growth, in the near term?
Yeah, I love that question. Thank you. I'd like to sort of answer that in two ways. One is, are there any historical experiences for how this could play out? And the other is, looking at the arc of economic development, are there people who could replace China in its remarkable growth story? The second one I'll take first, and I'm a little harder pressed. China's a miracle. I mean, up until now, up into the geopolitical and macroeconomic tensions, you look at lifting, 500 million people out of poverty and into something resembling a middle class. That as an achievement is unparalleled, I think, in human experience. Could the Indians get there? I sure hope so. It's hard to be enthusiastic about Indian aviation because they've had a real time balancing demand and profit. They're probably our closest hope to get to what China has been. I'd like to say I saw more going on in Africa, and there are people who are hopeful. Certainly there are a few standouts, Ethiopia and wherever else, but just not on the same scale. Latin America, I'm afraid, has been a bit quiet for some time, marginal growth. I guess it comes back to India. But anyway, the other one that I think about as a kind of bad case scenario, what would happen with China? If you have a moment, please go to my website. It's richardaboulafia.com. It's free. And it's also free. I wrote a note in Foreign Policy magazine back, I think, October, talking about a possible aviation Cold War between the US and China. You can find that link in my website around October, I believe. And my feeling was it could unfold like the creation of the old Soviet Union's ecosystem, where they had kind of this weird funhouse mirror image of ours. It's not a 727, it's a Tupolev 154. It's not a Concorde, it's a Tupolev 144. Everything was replicated. The supply chains were replicated, the suppliers were replicated, the airlines were replicated. None of it was as good, but they closed the borders and it was fine. Now, we know how the movie ended. It didn't end well. I think if China went that way, it would not end well, but it could take a long time before that plays out. And I hope that both in the West and in China, everyone is mindful of that scenario, not just in aviation, but in the entire economy and in politics. And we find accommodation in continuing a mutually beneficial economic and political relationship. That would be a lot better than repeating that Soviet experience.
So, Richard, we're running short on time. I apologize again to everybody whose questions we won't be able to get through. I do have one question. Somebody would like to know if you have a scotch of choice.
Well, I just happen to have Lafroig here. I'm not a subtle person, so I like getting hit on the head with smoke and peat. Lafroig or Lagavulin is the answer. Thanks so much for asking.
So,
Go ahead, Ron.
On that note, it is we are getting close to the end of the webinar. Richard, want to thank you again for your time and presenting perhaps somewhat depressing information in as light a way as possible. And it sounds like we all have a tough couple of years at least ahead of us.
I really appreciate everyone showing up and to the museum for having me on and hosting me like this. And I really hope to have the opportunity of presenting in person as soon as circumstances permit.
Well,
Until then, everyone stay safe.
I just want to take one last opportunity to thank our sponsors again. You've heard their names: Key Bank, Robinson and Cole, Cohn-Resnick, and Stangeron and Associates. We really appreciate their support. As you heard Scott Ashton say earlier, we do really welcome and appreciate any contributions that people can make towards supporting programs like this. You can go to our website, www.neam.org, if you're interested in supporting us. And we hope that you will all return for future webinars. We have some great events planned for later in the year. Stay tuned and have a good night. Okay.